Last year, this city had the fastest rising rents out of anywhere in the UK. It wasn't London, it wasn't Manchester, it wasn't Birmingham, it was Newport, here in South Wales. In an era when there's more landlords than teachers, renting is pretty much everywhere. But Cymru is also a bit of a special case because rent here is rising faster than anywhere else in the whole of the UK. Now that's despite the fact that Wales has the oldest, worst conditioned houses. And if you're a local trying to get on the housing ladder when deprivation comes into account, there is no harder place than South East Wales in order to get a property. The question is, why is Newport so special? It's got the highest percentage of under 15s in Cymru. And in the 12 months to July 2025, rent here rose by a blinding 21%. It's basically like Legoland for landlords. Tons of bricks paid for by someone else and loads of kids to take advantage of. So ahead of the most important Senedd elections in history on May 7th, Novara Media has come here to work out why landlords have got their eye on Newport. What is it about Newport? How is it different from other cities in Cymru?
Yeah, so I actually recently opened an office and I actually chose Newport instead of Cardiff, which what a lot of people would expect to do. And a reason for that is that Newport's got a bit of an edge. It's got an incredible history. If you look at its live music scene, it's always done stuff its own way. But the main reason that I did that is because Newport has got the largest, well, the fastest growing young population in the whole of Wales. Wales has a real issue with an ageing population. Most parts of Wales are seeing population decreases and an ageing population, whereas Newport is really bucking the trend. Since 2011, there's been a 10% increase in the population, and it's also seen the fastest growing amount of under 16s. So really the future of Wales is in a city like Newport. It's really well positioned, it's close to Cardiff, it's close to the valleys, you've got Bristol across the bridge. I think it's just a really exciting place to be based.
Now, last year in your newsletter, you first broke the story about Newport having the fastest rising rents in the UK. What's the deal there? Like, why is that happening?
Yeah, well, part of it's down to demand. You know, more and more young people more likely to rent than older people, and that demand is driving up the price of renting. And I think it really blew people's mind that of all the places in the UK, it wasn't central London that had that fastest growing rate. It was right here in Newport, and that poses real challenges because if we're going with that contention that the future of Wales is here, if the future of Wales is paying disproportionately more than everywhere else, that's a real problem.
Now, the housing crisis is, of course, systemic, but South Wales is no stranger to rogue landlords. You were telling me earlier about your own experiences as a tenant with a landlord. What happened?
I was renting in a shared house, and one day my landlord let me know that he would be raising the rent 15% in the next couple of months. And when I asked why, he said that he'd been chatting to one of the tenants next door and found out that he was paying more than I was, and so he was raising the rent to match. So he'd been perfectly happy with what he was charging before that, but as soon as he found out he could get more money, he demanded it, basically.
So Aled, what's the significance of this building behind me in Newport here?
So we had a case as Acorn with a member of ours from Newport called Nicola, and Nicola's landlord had wrongfully withheld her deposit, hadn't given any justification for withholding hundreds of pounds. Nicola came to us asking us to do something about it as a community union. And this hotel, we believe, is owned by a landlord, or at least this is the business address that he initially gave us to meet him at when we set up a meeting with him.
My name's Dan, I'm from Newport, Cardiff. This is our member Nicola, we used to be a landlord, and we're here today to get the deposit back that you have withheld for 7 months.
Shut up! Whoa, fucking ass! Right? So please, I'm not able to talk to you. I need an appointment.
Go through the documents.
Sir, you are a very stupid man.
But when we turned up with Nicola, explained the issue, explained that a justification hadn't been given for withholding the deposit and that we expected it to be returned, he got very angry, very violent, very abusive. Threatened violence against the women members who turned up on the day. and got very abrasive, but we held our own as a community organisation, made sure that Nicola, as our member, had her say.
So what's the feeling right now in South Wales in terms of the relationship between tenants and landlords? What are you seeing out there?
I think tenants are sort of just fed up of being the breadwinners for their landlords. They're paying off the landlords' mortgages. Quite often it's exorbitant rents and quite low value properties. The quality is really poor, the maintenance is really poor. I think there's just a feeling of blatant exploitation, and people have had enough of it. It's difficult because when you feel as though Westminster's failed, the Senedd has failed, local councils have failed, it's difficult to know what to do. But when we come together with our members, we can make a fight against all of these wrongdoings and give people a voice to something they desperately need.
It's a recurring theme. Failure, violence and exploitation where tenants pay the price, and all set against a historical backdrop of resistance. In 1839, the last armed uprising in Wales happened right here, as dozens of Chartist protesters were killed outside the Westgate Hotel. I want to say at this point that we originally confirmed an interview with Jane Bryant too, a local Newport MS who also happens to be the Cabinet Secretary for Housing and Local Government. But when we said we wanted to ask her questions about Labour's record on housing, we were left unread. We also asked Reform if they wanted to comment on their housing policy too, considering their leader in Wales, Dan Thomas, is also running for a seat here, but predictably, silence. Finally, we approached Shelter Cymru. They told us that while rent increases were slowing in 2026, that's to be expected because the rises were unsustainable. However, they said the answer was relatively straightforward. Implement a person-centred approach to homelessness, build a private rented sector that actually works for renters, and continue increasing investment in social housing to help tackle the record levels of demand that currently exist. In terms of specific policies, that will mean taking steps such as banning no-fault evictions in Wales, looking seriously at rent stabilisation measures, and reviewing how we can continue to increase social housing supply through building new homes and investing in acquiring existing ones. Following on from that, it's probably worth noting too that while all parties talk about building more homes, only Plaid Cymru and the Greens pitch versions of rent controls in their manifestos.
So take me on a bit of a journey, because from the perspective of the tenant, you're in Newport, the fastest rising rents last year in the whole of the UK, homelessness, a big problem in Newport as well. What is the journey that tenant goes on when the landlord makes these decisions to hike up their rents?
Well, it can often be a very short journey. There's not that many steps in it. If you're a working class person in Newport or anywhere else in South Wales, you're going to need somewhere to live. The opportunities to buy as a young person are getting, less and less. And so you're probably going to go to the private rental sector. You'll get into a bidding war, likely, with a bunch of tenants. You'll end up viewing 10, 12, 15 properties before you finally find somewhere where all the stars align and you can move in. You might be there for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and suddenly your landlord thinks of a bigger number. All the other landlords in your city, in your community, in the country think of a bigger number as well. And they all decide collectively to hike the rents. And either you can afford it or you can't. And it's increasingly becoming the case that working class people, young people, they can't afford these rent hikes. And so what do?
You also mentioned that Newport has the worst homelessness crisis in Wales, per, I think it's 10,000 people per capita. Could you draw me the connection there between Newport as the fastest rising rents in the UK and now seemingly has one of the worst homelessness or fastest growing homelessness problems in Wales too?
So in really simple terms, if you don't build more homes and you have a really fast growing population, and not just a fast growing population of people moving in, a fast growing people of young people becoming adults who are by far most likely to rent, much more likely to rent than other demographics, that is inevitably going to create a homelessness crisis.
In your new book, Who Cares About Wales, you describe Margaret Thatcher as having a borderline sexual kink for the open market. What is it about Margaret Thatcher and her legacy that is still punishing Newport today in terms of rent and in terms of housing?
Well, I think what we saw in the 80s was a movement away from how we deal with that question of how we support people who can't afford to pay the market rate for a place to live, for a home, a really fundamental right. And before the 1980s, the state would provide that in the form of council houses. And there was a change in the 80s, early 90s, where we basically said, right, what we're going to do instead is we are going to say that the benefit system is going to pick up that slack. So what they introduced was local housing allowance, and that's what we use now. And that's basically the proportion of support you can get from for your rent. Now, it's a bit complicated, but basically they take the average level in an area, and it used to be 50%. So it used to be like 50%, you can get a house worth 50% of the average value in your area. You'll get supported towards that if you can't afford a home. But what we saw under the Tories is the Tories reduced that down to 30%, and then they froze the rate. So inflation made that proportionally poorer and poorer and poorer. When Labour came in, Rishi Sunak had just increased it back to that 50%, but the first thing that the Labour government did was to freeze it. And by freezing it, it meant that proportionally every year the amount that you could get to support your rent went down. Now that is not a problem if rents aren't going up. In an area like Newport, where it's going up faster than anywhere else in the UK, that means that it hit that decision by a UK government, a UK Labour government, actually hit the people of Newport who, for time immemorial, have voted Labour. It hit them harder than any other part of the UK.
What are the numbers for Wales specifically? Like, what is the picture of housing right now in Cymru?
So right now, people across Wales are paying on average 41% of their income on private rent, which is much higher than what it should be.
You're spending almost half of your income on rent.
Absolutely, and what that does is it means that people cannot put money into the local economy. It means that they can't save for their own welfare. It means that they may have to move because they can't afford to live in the place where they built a community, where they might have grown up and lived since childhood. So they are pushed elsewhere. So it's about community fragmentation as well, ultimately.
And when you talk about community fragmentation, this is something that Reform has sought to capitalise on in Wales. Mm-hmm. It's something that Reform has sought to capitalise on in England as well. How much of this is unique to Wales and how much of it is a global struggle in some senses against the breakdown of liberal capitalism?
I think it's absolutely a global struggle. I think that when people don't have the financial freedom to live in the place where they feel at home, they feel less stable, they feel less community, inevitably. And that means that they start making difficult financial choices, but they also start making much more difficult interpersonal choices as well. And I think that vulnerability creates a really politically unstable environment.
Newport should be a story of hope. All across Wales, the population is the oldest in the whole of the UK. But in Newport, it's bucking the trend. If Wales wants a bright future, it needs to be led by places like this and the young people in it. But unfortunately, that's not the story. As we heard earlier from some of the members of Acorn, there are young people in Newport and across South Wales are facing one of the worst rental crises in the whole of the UK. Now, we heard earlier about the transformational impact that having a bad landlord can have, the things that can help define how you set up your future for success. When we think about the future of Cymru, it's these people that are right at the heart of it. A Marxist historian called Gwynalf Williams once said that if capitalism in the British Isles lives, Wales will die. If Wales is to live, capitalism in the British Isles must die. And when it comes down to the Senedd elections on May the 7th, it's the lifeblood of Wales that's on the ballot.